Hello, a few folks are still joining us, so we'll get started in just a minute. Good afternoon, and many thanks for joining us. My name is Andrew Christopherson, and I work in the Feinberg School of Medicine Development Office. It is a pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Sachin Patel, who will be discussing advances in brain science and the future of mental health care. After a national search last year, Dr. Patel was selected to serve as chair of Northwestern's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. He also holds the Lizzie Gilman Endowed Professorship and is the psychiatrist in chief at the Stone Institute of Psychiatry. Dr. Patel joins us from Vanderbilt, where he rose to the rank of full professor and director of the Division of General Psychiatry. While at Vanderbilt, he received numerous honors for his commitment to medical research, clinical care, and education, including the Chancellor's Research Award and the Outstanding Teacher of the Year Award. An accomplished physician scientist, Dr. Patel has published many peer-reviewed articles, books, and chapters focused on psychiatric neuroscience. At the end of Dr. Patel's talk, we have allotted time for him to answer questions. Thank you to those of you who pre-submitted questions when registering for the webinar. You may also ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll aim to get to as many of them as possible. Thank you again, Dr. Patel, for sharing your time and expertise, and please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew, for the introduction, and welcome to everybody that's joining us this evening. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen for the initial part of this talk, which would be a slide presentation. All right, I hope everyone can view these slides okay. All right, so I'd like to spend the next 30 to 45 minutes discussing various aspects of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. I've been here, Andrew may have mentioned, for about 6 months. And even prior to coming here, was involved in many discussions about the future of the department and the vision for really taking it to the next level of national recognition within all three missions. For example, the research mission, our clinical enterprise, and also our educational programs. And I think all encompassing, our vision can be articulated in that we see ourselves as ultimately becoming a national leader recognized for innovative, patient-centered, and collaborative behavioral health care, to educate the next generation of behavioral health clinicians and academic leaders, and to be on the forefront of translational and clinical research relevant to mental health and its treatment. So I'm going to talk about three areas over the next few minutes. The first is a little bit of an overview of our clinical enterprise and some of the programs we're currently working on and interested in developing, and talk a little bit about our educational programs, and then spend a little bit more time talking in depth about new research initiatives, new centers, and existing programs in both basic neuroscience, clinical neuroscience, epidemiology, and public health that really set us apart from many other departments of psychiatry. So just to give folks a little bit of background on the structure and the scope of the department, things have changed over the years. And when I arrived, we had to do sort of a deep dive into the census and kind of how we're going to organize the department moving forward. We have 376 total faculty. Out of those, almost 70 are primarily clinical faculty, and approximately another 60 are primarily research faculty with some overlap. We also have a large number of faculty in the community that assist us with our educational programs and other services to the department, but primarily practice outside of our Chicago campus. We also have a large number of residents and fellows, as well as PhD students, which I'll touch on a little bit in our next slide. We have 5 clinical divisions, a division of general psychiatry, consultation liaison psychiatry, which provides clinical care to those hospitalized patients throughout the health system and medical center, a division of forensic psychiatry, a division of addiction psychiatry, and a division of psychology that provides both research as well as psychological services to our patients. We have, of course, a number of clinical programs. I'm just highlighting a few here. In addition to our existing programs, I want to touch on 3 that we're really excited about launching in the next 6 to 12 months, and that we feel are services that could really increase the ability of our department to serve the health system as well as patients in the Chicago area. And the first is a neuromodulation and interventional psychiatry program. So in the past 5 to 7 years, novel rapid-acting treatments for psychiatric disorders, for example, ketamine, brexanolone, which was recently approved for the treatment of postpartum depression, represent a completely new way of thinking about medications for previously difficult to treat and treatment-resistant disorders such as major depression and others. And so we're working hard to be able to launch programs that allow us to provide these emerging treatments to patients. Things like transcortical magnetic stimulation and electroconvulsive therapy, and using comprehensive neuromodulation program to really house all of these new and emerging treatments and be able to add that to something that's available for our patients. These, of course, could be coupled to educational programs. So our hope is to ultimately have a fellowship training for psychiatry residents in interventional psychiatry. And we believe this is going to be an outstanding addition to the department. And we hope to initiate this within the next 6 to 9 months. Other areas of interest and growth include gender mental health. We have a large plastic surgery program that's dedicated to gender affirming care. And a lot of folks that seek treatment in that area could also benefit from mental health care. And a lot of what we're doing is recruiting folks, including psychiatrists and other clinicians that have expertise in treating people involved in the general mental health pathways, both at Lurie Children's Hospital as well as Northwestern Memorial Hospital. We're also very interested in expanding our division of what we're calling comprehensive medical psychiatry. This will expand our consultation liaison service and involves a number of service lines, including consultation services to our inpatient psychiatry, medical, surgical, ICU, but also expanding services we provide to departments like transplant psychiatry. There's a lot of need for folks that are undergoing pre-transplant surgical evaluations to have psychological and psychiatric consultations, as well as follow-up after surgical transplantation. Other specialties such as gastroenterology, urology, as well as primary care could benefit from enhanced collaborations with our department. And we're very interested in enhancing our ability to provide psychiatric and psychological services for patients that are undergoing complex gastrointestinal treatment, treatment for urological disorders, as well as increasing our capacity to provide mental health care within primary care clinics. We currently serve about 5 to 7 primary care clinics, and we're very interested in being able to provide mental health care embedded in the community in a more accessible way. So globally, we view this as our approach to comprehensive medical psychiatry and view this as a high priority in terms of our clinical mission expansion in the next year. We're a large department with respect to educational programs, and I've listed a few of those here. Just first to highlight our adult psychiatry residency program. 2 important things that I want to highlight within that is that we have a specific dedicated research track. This is for applicants that have a background in psychiatric research and are interested in careers in academic psychiatry and research. This is funded by an NIH grant that allows us to actually recruit an additional resident every year into this program. And it's a great way to attract some of the top talent around the country to Northwestern. We're also launching a new clinical educator track within our residency, and this is meant to really attract medical students interested in psychiatry, but specifically academic psychiatry and medical education. And we hope this will be attractive to a national pool of applicants that are interested in academic medicine. We also have a number of fellowships, our consultation liaison fellowship, forensics, geriatrics, addictions, and women's health also. Somewhat unique aspects to our department in that we have a very large division of psychology that houses a PhD program in clinical psychology. It's a highly competitive program. It also offers a master's degree, clinical psychology internship, as well as neuropsychology fellowship. So we are in a unique position to have training programs in psychiatry and psychology and really capitalize on the expertise of those training programs together to provide our trainees with really comprehensive training in psychiatry and psychology and mental health treatment. I want to spend a little bit more time talking about some of our research portfolio. And this is just a little bit of history. When I arrived in the department, it was important to get a sense of where the department has been and where it's going and where we would like it to be in the next 3 to 5 years. And as you can see, our research dollars, so to speak, in terms of the amount of funding the department has to conduct psychiatric research has grown between 2015 and this year, and we hope to continue that trend over the next 3 to 5 years. And commensurate with that increase in funding from agencies such as the NIH and CDC and other organizations, our national rankings continue to improve. So here we can see some of the top ranked national institutions and academic institutions in departments of psychiatry. Right now, we're around number 27 nationally, which is quite good, given that there are several hundred medical schools. And our goal, of course, is to increase that ranking. And I think obtaining a top 20 ranking within the next 4 to 5 years is within our grasp. And really, that's one of the strategic goals I've set for the department. So my background, as Andrew briefly mentioned, is in psychiatric neuroscience. My interest is really focused on how the brain works and how understanding fundamental processes that the brain is involved in terms of generating emotional states, cognitive processes, and executive function, and how those processes deteriorate during mental illnesses such as depression, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other anxiety and stress-related disorders. And I really believe that we're at a tipping point, hence the title of this talk. And I like to just take a brief divergence and make the analogy to the field of genetics and cancer. And so I like to think of psychiatric neuroscience in analogy to genetics, the Human Genome Project, and molecular biology, being about 25 to maybe 30 years behind that field. And so if you could imagine and think back to the late 1980s and early 90s, the immense investment in the Human Genome Project, in understanding how DNA works, molecular biology, all of that huge national investment through the NIH and through academic centers, as well as industry, all of that investment is really bearing fruit only within the past 5 to 10 years. And I think people undoubtedly understand this. For example, the number of new cancer treatments that are emerging literally every month or every few months are really based on the investment in fundamental understanding of DNA biology that occurred about 30 years ago. And without that deep investment into understanding how DNA works, we would not have personalized treatments for cancer today. We would not have the ability to profile individual tumors from patients and select and deliver targeted genetic therapies for those disorders. And the advancements in cancer treatment that we're seeing today are really a product of that investment that occurred within the 1980s and 1990s. And I view psychiatric neuroscience in that same vein. We're at a point where we need to invest in understanding how the brain fundamentally works. Without that, it's going to be nearly impossible to develop truly novel treatments for major psychiatric disorders, such as difficult to treat depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, schizophrenia, et cetera. And really that's highlighted by the fact that drug development and new treatments for these disorders have been relatively stagnant over the past 4 decades. There have been some new treatments, but fundamental advances in really conceptually new treatments have been quite limited. And in my view, a lot of that is because we fundamentally do not understand the etiology or how these disorders arise in the brain. And so part of what I wanted to do in taking this position as chair of the department here at Northwestern was to launch a Northwestern Center for Psychiatric Neuroscience. This will be focused on bringing together clinicians, scientists, and physician scientists aimed at meeting this challenge, which is really to understand how the brain is able to do the amazing things that it does, and more importantly, how these things begin to deteriorate when people are afflicted with psychiatric disorders. And so I just want to go through an example of a few things that we've done in really the short time since probably November when we conceptualized the launch of this center. So we've hired 3 faculty. Dr. Rosas Vidal actually is joining me from Vanderbilt. He is very interested in understanding opioid stress interactions. He's interested in elucidating the brain circuits that determine really how we view what is safe and unsafe in the world, and how opioid systems regulate these neural circuits. And this is important for understanding the high comorbidity between opioid use and patients with PTSD. There's a strong comorbidity, unfortunately, between substance use disorders and stress-related disorders like PTSD, and understanding how the brain circuits and cell types are regulating what we consider safe and fearful are really critical to then ultimately understanding what causes post-traumatic stress disorder and potentially finding novel treatments for that, especially for those that have comorbid substance use disorder, specifically opioid use disorder. And we're delighted that Dr. Rosas Vidal has started his lab. He arrived a few months ago and is up and going. He has a career development award that's funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. These are given to outstanding physician scientists with strong potential to make important discoveries in mental health research. We have also recruited Dr. Risha Patel from the Salk Institute in San Diego. She recently decided to join us here after about a 3-month recruitment period, and she'll be starting her lab in the center in the spring of 2023. Her interest really is based on the fact that she's found that social rank and different aspects of social isolation predict alcohol drinking in various types of animal preclinical models. And that the amygdala, which is really a brain region that's sort of the seat of emotion in the brain, detects these social states and then is responsible for driving changes in alcohol intake in these model systems. And she believes that these findings will really allow us to identify patients that may be susceptible to alcohol use disorder and to take preventative action in susceptible individuals, and also understanding more about how social stress, of course, that's highlighted by COVID over the past several years, may interact with patients that have substance use disorders, including alcohol use disorder. And by understanding how social structure affects drinking, that might put us in a much better position to make preemptive preventative measures in people that might be at risk. And lastly, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lee, also joining us from the Salk Institute in San Diego, likely in the spring. He'll be joining the Center for Psychiatric Neuroscience with a similar focus based on recent discoveries he made published in the journal Nature a few months ago, which was that this new brain molecule called neurotensin is responsible for associating good and bad feelings with certain memories. And he thinks that this discovery will really pave the way for understanding why some people are more likely to retain negative emotional memories relative to positive emotional memories. And understanding the neurobiology of how these memories are formed will be important for understanding the etiology of disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. And then being able to modulate these molecules through potentially new drugs or other interventions might be able to reverse these associations and use for potentially novel treatments for disorders, again, like PTSD, depression, and maybe even substance use disorders. And lastly, as Andrew mentioned, I moved from Vanderbilt in January. I also brought my own laboratory with me, and our interest is really focused on cannabinoids in the brain. And here I have a slide really showing that in addition to cannabinoids that are produced by plants that many of us know about, from the media with increasing legalization of cannabis in many states, our interest is really focused on the fact that our brain also produces cannabinoids. They look a little different chemically, but they act at the same receptors in the brain. And we know from years of work that we and others have done that these molecules are heavily involved in processes like anxiety, depression, fear, and stress regulation. So part of what we're interested in is understanding how cannabinoids affect brain function and how these endogenously produced cannabinoid molecules regulate stress reactivity in the brain. And understanding the roles of these systems could lead to new treatments for disorders like depression, PTSD, and substance use disorders. And again, I'm happy to speak to anyone on the call in more detail about any of the work we're doing or work that some of the investigators that we've recently recruited are interested in doing at the center. And hope people are as excited about this venture as I am. I really feel like we are in a unique opportunity given the resources of the Feinberg Medical School at large, strengths of other departments, including the Department of Neuroscience, Neurology, Psychology at the Evanston campus, to really collaborate across the institution to focus on translational neuroscience that has the ability to really advance our understanding of psychiatric disorder and ideally potentially reveal new treatments that might emerge through that research. So again, we're seeking partners to help us that share our vision, that understanding the brain is the way to ultimately increase treatment for patients, and that modern neuroscience approaches that are emerging will really allow us to do that in a way that has simply been unprecedented and really unimaginable even 5 or 10 years ago. I want to move to highlight now a few of the other really seminal research programs that our department is involved in. And one is the Health Disparities and Public Policy Research program. So moving from understanding basic mechanisms using model systems now to some of the work we're doing at the epidemiological level with patients and in our community. Linda Teplin has run this program for decades here at Northwestern. And she likes to remind me that decades ago, when people wanted to study the natural course of psychiatric illnesses, they would go into hospitals. Unfortunately, processes of trans-institutionalization that occurred in the 70s and 80s really, unfortunately, ended up transitioning a lot of mental health care to the carceral system as long-term hospitals and treatment facilities were closed by federal and state agencies. The unfortunate and unintended consequence of that was that many people with chronic and persistent mental illness were relegated to the criminal justice system. And so Dr. Teplin and her group embarked on a series of landmark longitudinal studies starting many, many years ago, and have decades worth of samples of folks that have been unfortunately interacting with the justice system in one way or another and understanding the healthcare disparities that arise when patients are interacting with our criminal justice system. This work has been funded by over 20 federal agencies, and results of these studies have been published in extremely high impact nationally recognized journals such as JAMA Psychiatry and JAMA Pediatrics, for example. And some of the important data she's shown is that mental health care is extremely common in incarcerated youth. And if we look at it by various demographics, we know that very, very, very small proportion of those actually receive treatment, which is not surprising. She's also found through these decades of longitudinal research that unfortunately there's a high mortality rate of youth that are incarcerated. And she's found that approximately 25% of folks that interact with the criminal justice system had either been injured or killed by firearms. And we can see this based on both Black, Latinx, and white. The mortality rate for youth that interact with the criminal justice system is substantially higher than those that don't. And so what might the mental health implications for her research be? And she's described a few of those here for me. And so I'd like to reiterate that the work that she's conducted over 30 years here in the Chicagoland area has precipitated change in psychiatric services, including enhanced screening and treatment of psychiatric disorders in correctional systems, advancement of gender-specific programs, and including increased services for youth with multiple psychiatric disorders. This include, for example, depression as well as drug use disorders, for example. Her research has also demonstrated the need for psychiatric interventions, specifically that support psychosocial development, also targeting risk factors for violent death, supporting adolescent victims of firearm violence, and addressing racial and ethnic disparities pre and post incarceration. So highlighting healthcare disparities in youth that have interactions with the incarcerated, the carceral system, have had a significant impact on the mental health care of folks in this region that interact with the criminal justice system. The other large group of research that we have is focused on implementation sciences. And really what that is focused on closing the gap between what we know works and what we do. And a quote here is that it takes about 17 years to turn 14% of original research into benefits to patients. And the graph here really illustrates that in terms of an idea being proposed and funded by agencies like the NIH and CDC and others, the review of that process, developing it, publishing those results, synthesizing those, and those results ultimately resulting in changes in treatment guidelines, which then affect practice, can take almost 2 decades. And so implementation science is really focused on accelerating that pipeline of discovery to actual impact for patients. And another quote Dr. Hendricks Brown provided me was that, the use of effective interventions without implementation strategies is like a serum without a syringe. The cure is not available. The delivery system is not there. So being able to improve the way we take what we know works and deliver that to patients is a major focus of 2 very senior and highly funded investigators within the department, Hendricks Brown, who runs the NIH Center for Implementation Methodology. His focus is on methods to improve implementation research, agent-based modeling, and building partnerships to advance equity in the delivery of mental health care. Dr. Sarah Becker was also a recent recruit. She'll be joining the department from Brown University, arriving in August. She works at the Institute for Public Health and Medicine, and she'll be starting the Center for Dissemination and Implementation Sciences. And her focus is on the implementation strategy evaluation, direct-to-consumer marketing, workforce development, and stakeholder engagement. And what is the impact of this type of research on mental health? The research that Dr. Brown and Dr. Becker have conducted have led to a number of important advances, including suicide prevention programs in the US Air Force, sustainability of federally funded state opioid treatment programs, treatment of methamphetamine with contingency management programs, delivery of an evidence-based intervention for alcohol misuse in pediatric trauma centers, national testing of implementation strategies to prevent HIV infection, and implementation of collaborative models of care for depression in Northwestern primary care clinics, which dovetails nicely with some of the things I mentioned in our clinical expansion, which includes enhanced psychiatric services within primary care settings. So in closing, I'd really like to say that I feel that the department is poised to make really important advances in the education of future psychiatric residents, fellows, and psychologists and others involved in mental health care in the region. I think our focus on advancing research, both at the translational neuroscience level, all the way through epidemiology and implementation sciences, puts us in a position to have an important impact nationally on, one, determining and elucidating novel fundamental mechanisms of psychiatric disorders, elucidating novel treatments, as well as understanding healthcare disparities and figuring out ways to advance what we know works into practice and advancing the ability to deliver that care to patients where they need it. I think if we commit to advancing those missions, advancing our clinical programmatic growth, advancing the education and focusing on educating leaders of the future, that will allow our national reputation to grow, and that Northwestern Department of Psychiatry will ultimately be a place nationally that's thought of in high regard, and a place that people will want to come and expect and get the best psychiatric care by physicians that are on the forefront of research and education. I'd like to thank everybody for their attendance. I know this was a bit of a whirlwind. I'm looking forward to speaking with anyone on the call in person to give them more information and have discussions about what they feel are important to them, get more insight into what they feel are things that the department should be involved in, as well as have discussions about anything that people feel are important for the future of mental health in the Chicago area and nationally. I believe we have some time for questions, and maybe we can turn it over to Andrew to moderate the Q&A portion of the webinar.
Wonderful insights. Thanks so much, Dr. Patel. Yes, as Dr. Patel mentioned, at this time, we'll get to some of the questions that were pre-submitted, as well as some of the ones that have come in on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. First, we have a question about integrated healthcare, and how do you see integrated healthcare fitting into the future of mental health care?
Yeah, so as I mentioned a few times, that really is probably one of the greatest healthcare needs nationally in terms of how mental health care and screening and early screening and intervention is implemented at the community level, primary care. And so again, we have several things that we're trying to advance and grow, including our presence in the collaborative care clinics around the Chicagoland area and beyond regionally, as well as increasing our presence within the health system and the hospital and providing psychiatric care to patients that are medically ill. You know, this includes people undergoing surgical interventions that may also have comorbid psychiatric illness, and making sure that both of those are being addressed. You know, a lot of physical illnesses have a significant impact on the brain. We know that. We know that infection, not just COVID, all infections affect the way we feel mentally, our emotional state, and making sure that that's not ignored when people come into the hospital that have, for example, pre-existing depression that's made worse by a physical illness. And we want to make sure that we're able to preemptively make sure that we're addressing those in hospitalized patients, but also increasing the awareness in primary care clinics with internal medicine, family medicine, pediatrics, that really integrating behavioral health into their sort of standard workflow is really something that we want to work with them on and provide them the assistance in making that a reality.
Thank you, Dr. Patel. We have a question also about how can psychotherapy influence the biology of mental illnesses?
Yeah, so this is a really important area of research. So we know that psychotherapy changes the brain. It can change how we feel, it can change how we think, and it can be very effective for certain types of psychiatric illnesses. Most psychotherapy is most effective when combined with other treatments, sometimes medications, for example. But an important thing I'll highlight is that some of the brain changes, the functional changes that we can actually see in the brain when people improve in terms of, let's say, folks that have major depression as they get better, whether that's from medications or from psychotherapy, we see the same types of functional changes occurring. So we know that regardless of what the modality is, whether that's intensive psychotherapy or whether that's antidepressant treatment, the brain is changing, and it's changing in a very similar way. Maybe not identical, but in terms of the things that we can visualize in the brain, there's a lot of overlap, which tells us there may be common mechanisms that psychotherapy and some medications might be tapping into to improve people's mental health.
Thanks, Dr. Patel. And then we have a question about schizophrenia and also about inflammation. And if you could share some thoughts on if schizophrenia is primarily an inflammatory disorder and if treatment should follow that paradigm.
Yeah. So this is a broader question, goes beyond schizophrenia. There's a lot of interest in understanding how inflammation, I mentioned this just in the previous question, right? That when people are sick, our bodies release a lot of inflammatory mediators like cytokines and prostaglandins, and those get into the brain and they affect how we feel. And in the preclinical neuroscience realm, we call that sickness behavior. And there's a lot of interest in understanding the biology of sickness behavior. There are many theories related to how inflammation might be associated with schizophrenia risk, for example. There's epidemiological evidence that suggests that certain types of infections, especially early on or even in utero, certain viral infections and exposure to immunological molecules might increase the risk for offspring or kids for developing these types of disorders. There's a lot of interest in using immunological treatments for psychiatric disorders. Not as much yet in schizophrenia, more so in depression. And there's also a lot of interest in understanding subtypes of depression that might be more linked to inflammation than others. So depression, we're learning more and more, is not a unified disease. There are subtypes of depression. And again, going back to the neuroscience of this, if we can understand those subtypes and how different types of brain circuits and brain cells might be contributing to different subtypes of depression, it might allow us to develop more targeted, personalized treatments. There may be subtypes of depression that are much more associated with inflammation and immunological challenge than other types. And if we're able to disentangle those diagnostically, as well as understand the biology of that type of inflammatory depression, that might allow us to target anti-inflammatory medications, for example, for the people that need it, that we know have that subtype of depression, and understanding the biology is what's going to allow us to develop those immunological treatments for depression. So lots of interest in that. It's an extremely important area. And I would bet in probably 10 to 15 years, we would probably have immunologically based targeted treatments for subtypes of depression, for example, that we know are causally related to overactive inflammation.
Great, thank you. And then your slides about the rankings and where we stand and where we hope to go as a department was helpful to see as well. If you could just comment on what is needed to further advance brain science and help take the work of the department to the next level. Any sort of research, resources, people, any sort of comments about that would be appreciated.
Yeah, I think it's really two things, right? Great science comes from attracting the best people nationally and internationally to Northwestern and the department. And the way we do that is by having the best infrastructure and the best resources so that people can do the best cutting edge science here and make those really important discoveries. And so the platform that you and I and other people here have worked on, one aspect of that is the Center for Psychiatric Neuroscience, really to have a platform to attract the best talent, people that are on the forefront of thinking about how understanding the brain is going to advance our understanding of psychiatry, mental illness, and new treatment. So providing those new investigators with the resources for the best equipment, the best infrastructure, that's going to allow us to attract the best talent from around the world to help us fulfill that mission. So having a center that's got the most advanced technology, the ability to attract the best trainees, through fellowships, through equipment grants, and through endowed professorships that allows us to attract the best talent from around the world is really going to be, I think, the most instrumental thing we could do to advance that mission.
And I think we have time for one other question. You mentioned briefly that substance use disorders were heightened during the pandemic. If you could just share some comments that you and your faculty have seen over the past 2 years and a few months since the start of the pandemic, just in terms of trends, that would be appreciated.
Yeah. So certainly we know that most objectively, for example, mortality from overdose deaths have continued to skyrocket through the epidemic. They were on the upswing before, and they've continued on an unsustainable trajectory for our society and our country. I think the stress of early on the isolation, the subsequent financial stressors that people were under, secondary to a lot of the downturn in the economy, all of those things have put immense stress on many, many people in our society. And unfortunately, the largest burden of that has been focused on people from really some marginalized communities, lower socioeconomic status, that don't often have the access to the mental health care. So all of these things have really compounded the mental health epidemic over the past 2 years. These things were always there, but COVID pandemic has really brought those, I think, a lot more to the forefront. And it's also given people an opportunity to reflect on really what's important. And their mental health and wellness as a society has really risen to the top of that. I think it's given people the understanding that we have to, as a society, be physically and mentally well to be able to engage personally with family, but also nationally and in the world stage. We have to have a commitment to our mental health. So I think the benefit of that is people are much more open about that now. There's still a lot of stigma around mental health and specifically around substance use disorders, but it's getting better. And I think the more people that understand these are biological disorders, they're caused by brain dysfunction that can be treated, I think is going to be beneficial on a national level to be able to get more people engaged in treatment and have at large a healthier population. So while the pandemic has been horrific in terms of mortality, I think one of the benefits that emerged, for example, is the dramatic expansion of telehealth services for psychiatry. Right? When the pandemic hit, Northwestern, Vanderbilt, and almost every other major health system was very quickly able to adapt and provide video-based treatment for psychiatric disorders. That unintended positive consequence of that has been that our technological savvy has increased dramatically. And now we're actually able to provide people mental health care in ways that are a lot more accessible to them. Telehealth has allowed people not to take an entire half day off of work to see a therapist or a psychiatrist. They can do a 20-minute video conference and get a lot of what they were really not able to get 3 years ago. So I think we have a long way to go. There's been a lot of exacerbation of the pandemic on mental health and substance abuse, but I think some of the positive aspects, including the technological sort of innovation that's occurred around that, has given us some hope that we can maybe reach some folks that we may not have been able to 3 or 4 years ago.
That's certainly a silver lining. Well, thank you again, Dr. Patel, for taking the time to join us and for sharing your expertise. For anyone who joined partway through the webinar, a link to the recording will be distributed in the coming days. Finally, to the Northwestern alumni and supporters who joined us today, we appreciate your time and continued partnership. And if we didn't get to your question, we'll make note of it and try to follow up with you later this week or very soon. So we hope you enjoyed the program with Dr. Patel and look forward to staying in touch. Thanks again. Have a great evening.